A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test him and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal and took him to an inn and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?" He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord. On March 29th of this year, on Good Friday, the people of our nation heard about and read about and saw the picture of a man named Christopher Knopfel. Now, his fame was fleeting, and 3.5 months later, most people don't remember that they ever heard his name. And if you looked at his life story, you would think, gosh, this is somebody who was never destined to become famous to begin with. Chris was born in 1980 in a little town outside of Pittsburgh, a town called Baden, Pennsylvania. And his life got off to a pretty rough start. He began using OxyContin when he was in middle school, and by the time he was finished with high school, he was a heroin addict. He was still very smart, and for 3 years after that, he studied at the University of Pittsburgh, but eventually the drug habit got the better of him and he dropped out. And then he got in trouble with the law, and he got a pretty big rap sheet. He was charged with all kinds of offenses. He was charged with driving under the influence and driving without a license and child endangerment. And as often happens to addicts, he was charged with theft. And for 10 years he drifted from one halfway house to another. But he still had family members who cared about him and loved him. He had his mother, and he had a cousin who became so close to him that eventually he called her his sister. And they knew he was an addict, and they knew he had been a thief. And he might steal from them, but that didn't matter. They took him into their homes. First of all, he went to live with his cousin, and then he went to live with his mother. And each time, they gave him shelter, they fed him, and they encouraged him as he fought the drug addiction. And by 2010, he was back in Pittsburgh, and he had a girlfriend. And one day, she came into him and said that she was expecting a baby. Now, Chris was pretty preoccupied with his addiction and overcoming it, and he didn't really have room, he thought, in his life for a new baby. But later that year, she gave birth to a little girl. And a few weeks after that, Chris was with the little baby, and she started crying in her crib. And so he looked down, and he picked her up, and he took her in his arms. And she stopped crying, and she smiled at him. And later on, he said that was the most powerful thing he had ever felt in his life. It was more powerful than any drug he'd ever taken. And he saw that he didn't need drugs. And so from that point on, he quit using drugs at all. And by March of 2013, he'd been off drugs for 2.5 years, and he was back home living with his mother in Philadelphia. And he was looking for a career where he could help others as once he'd been helped. And so, on March 28th, he took the subway into Temple University, and he interviewed at the College of Medicine. And after the interview, he went back to the subway station to go home. But after he sat down in the station, he heard a commotion ahead of him, and he ran to see what was going on. And it turned out an older man had fallen from this platform onto the subway tracks. And Chris ran up, and he saw that all the other people in the station were just looking down at the man from the platform. Nobody went down to the tracks to help him. And so all by himself, Chris jumped down onto the tracks, and he shouted for the people to have the subway station master stop the trains. But he really didn't know whether the trains would stop, and he didn't know which of the rails carried any current, whether he might be electrocuted. But despite all that, he came up to the man, and he held his head and his neck in his arms, as once he'd held that little baby. And he kept the man from hurting himself anymore. And he stayed with him for about 15 minutes. I imagine it must have felt like a lifetime, until the firemen came and they took the older man away to the hospital. Now, what Chris didn't know was everything was happening right in front of a security camera. And so that night and the next day, people from Philadelphia and all over the nation saw the film of that man falling off the platform onto the tracks, and of Chris Knaufel, the addict, the outcast from society, jumping down onto the tracks to come to his aid. And when the reporters asked him, "Why did you do it? What made you do this when everybody else stayed put?" he thought about the people who had helped him when he was in trouble. And he said to them, "I can never repay them for what they did for me. The only thing I can do is to pay it forward." And the men and the women of the media referred to him, Chris Knaufel, in the image that we heard today in the gospel, the Good Samaritan of the subway, the one who came to the aid of the stranger in distress. And if we think of Chris's story, it gives us some insight into the parable. Yes, Christ calls us to strive for the image of the Good Samaritan. But first we should see ourselves for what we are, the image of the wounded traveler who yearns for the help of a stranger. And while each of us hopes for and hopefully receives the love and the comfort of those in our families and our friends, as Christians, more than anything else, we yearn for the love and the mercy and the comfort of the Word made flesh, the one who himself came into this world as a stranger. And like the family of Chris Knaufel, today he invites us into his home. And he knows our failings, and he overlooks them. And he comforts us with the words of eternal salvation. And then he invites us to receive him, just like Chris Knaufel received that little baby. And when we take him in our hands, the bread of life, the cup of salvation. It will be the most powerful thing that we will ever feel. And when we are blessed and sent forth, we will know and we will feel the mercy, the comfort, the great love that we've received. And we can never repay that gift. So we follow the command that he gives us today. Like Chris Knaufel, to those we meet, we go and do likewise.
Out of the corner of my eye, I seen like a body flail onto the tracks. I can't imagine not helping somebody in that situation. I can't imagine that.
A train could have come through. There are bad scenarios that could have happened here and didn't happen because a person that was unknown to our victim jumped into that track and saved his life.
There's so many times where there have been people there for me when I needed somebody, and these people I can't pay back. So the next best thing would be to pay it forward.
He's a hero. This is what Philadelphia is all about.